Hello and welcome to another lecture from Journalism and the Law. This is Professor Harper and my trusty assistant Sid, the Great Pyrenees dog, who has decided to join me today with a few barks. I apologize for that, but he's just trying to make the course more exciting. So, in terms of broadcasting, and also we'll be talking about what is called new media, new communications technologies, the U.S. Constitution obviously said nothing about broadcasting. It wasn't around. So how then could constitutional law, administrative law, statutory law deal with broadcasting? And how does broadcasting fit under the First Amendment? So, in going back to the history, there was a Wireless Ship Act of 1910, which required large ships to have wireless communications with operators, but it didn't help when it came to the Titanic disaster in 1912, and as a result of that terrible tragedy, we saw a lot more regulations and laws when it came to audio and later video. So in the Radio Act of 1912, the Secretary of Commerce had the ability to grant licenses. The major corporations bought these up, CBS, NBC, but in this law, there was a failure to limit frequencies and the power of transmission. Now, why is this important? Well, the signals for radio and video up until the past decade or so were called over the airwaves, and this is an audio and video spectrum where if I have 610 AM on the radio dial in Philadelphia and somebody has 660 AM in Camden, New Jersey, we're going to interfere with one another because it goes out over the airwaves. Now this has become almost it's not a significant problem for most cases because much of this goes through actual lines rather than over the airwaves, except for some radio broadcasts. Because of the limitations from the Act of 1912, the Radio Act of 1927 came into play, and it gave the U.S. government, through the Federal Radio Commission, the power to regulate radio. And it also established this principle of limited spectrum, 660 AM in Philadelphia versus 660 AM in Camden. And it also set into stone that the airwaves belonged to the public. Now, there were a few problems with the Radio Act, and so the Communications Act of 1934 came into play, and this one lasted for more than 60 years. It established the Federal Communication Commission, and I'll go into a small Harper rant here. I don't like the Federal Communications Commission for several reasons. One, it is an independent agency which has judicial, legislative, and executive privileges, so that in the executive part of it, it is the one that administers the regulations. In a legislative sense, it makes the regulations, and in a judicial sense, it operates as similar to a U.S. District Court when it comes to disputes. Now, there is some oversight because the President appoints the 5 members. The Congress must approve of the 5 members, but that's about it. And from starting out in radio, the Federal Communications Commission has expanded to oversee satellites, cellular telephones, cable television, and broadcasting television. For my money, it has too much power. Now, when it comes to print versus broadcast, print has more protection under the First Amendment than broadcast does. Because of this notion of scarcity of spectrum, it allows the government to come in and do a variety of things that will not be done in magazines, television, and also the internet. So when it comes to prior restraint, we'll see later that there are limitations on broadcasting when it comes to indecent speech and pornography. Broadcast entities are treated differently and defined differently from print and text. Going into some of the case law, we have in 1932 the Trinity Methodist Church versus the Federal Radio Commission, in which a federal appeals court said that that Reverend Robert Schuller, a conservative preacher, could not get a radio license because of his attacks on government, labor leaders, and other religions. It's interesting to note that only 1 year earlier, in Neer v. Minnesota, which we discussed, the U.S. Supreme Court had upheld a newspaper's right to do exactly what Schuller wanted to do. Okay. In 1969, we have the Red Lion Broadcasting case versus the FCC. Very important case. It's no longer in play, but it was very important for about 20 years. It established the fairness doctrine. And what that meant is that the FCC could force a broadcaster to carry specific programming. And it did a number of things, but mainly it involved if Chris Harper broadcaster gave 30 minutes of airtime to political candidate A, I had to give 30 minutes of broadcast time to political candidates B, C, and D. Okay, so in order to be fair, everyone got the same amount of time, with the same importance of the time. And the problem is that this made broadcasters shy away from political discussions because it ate up a whole bunch of time. And it's ironic that in only a few years, the court held exactly the opposite when it came to a newspaper in the Miami Herald Publishing Company versus Tornillo. Essentially, the Supreme Court decided that you could not force a newspaper to publish material from a political candidate and provide equal time to that individual. As I said, Red Lion only, and the FCC's fairness doctrine only existed for about 20 years because the FCC rescinded the fairness doctrine, although there have been a number of attempts to bring it back, primarily to serve as a limitation on conservative talk radio. Now, we also have a bit of more case law, a very important case about 40 years ago, Pacifica versus the FCC. Now, we saw this when it came to obscenity and indecency. This is the case that defined indecent words. George Carlin said the 7 dirty words over the airwaves, including, tits, motherfucker, words that generally are not used in polite conversation. And a child heard that over the radio. His father sued to say that this was a bad thing, and the court found that broadcasting was pervasive, that you couldn't really stop it from coming into your home or your car, and that it required more regulation and supervision than other media did. Now, as I said, the FCC is an independent agency. There are 5 commissioners with technically no political affiliation, but what happens is that under President Obama, for example, there are 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. Under former President George Bush, there were 3 Republicans, 2 Democrats. It's supposed to have no political affiliation, but it's gotten to be a pretty raucous bunch in the past 10 to 15 years. Now, as I said, the 1934 Act held for almost 60 years until the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And what this did a number of things. It changed the ownership rules to allow greater concentration of ownership for radio and television. It also attempted unsuccessfully to regulate pornography on the Internet. It expanded the number of television stations that could be owned nationally and locally. It allowed expanded cross-ownership of all media so that a newspaper could own a television station, radio station, and vice versa. And so that Rupert Murdoch can own the New York Post and the Wall Street Journal and Fox Television and Fox Television station in New York. Alternatively, NBC can own a cable outlet in MSNBC. So it essentially was supposed to create more competition. What it tended to do was create more concentration of media ownership. Now, Section 315 is important when it comes to regulation of broadcasting, specifically when it comes to political advertising. So all broadcast outlets must accept political advertising if it accepted it for at least one candidate. So if I took money from candidate A, I have to provide advertising at the lowest possible rate to candidates B, C, and D. Okay. I can refuse to accept any political broadcasting, but because that's a huge revenue stream for radio and television, particularly during a presidential election, that doesn't happen. So the broadcast outlet may not edit the advertisement. The material can be rejected for failing to meet technical standards. And one thing that's important is that the radio and television outlets do not face libel charges if I, Chris Harper, candidate for mayor, make defamatory comments about Fred Smith, candidate for mayor. Okay, so that the radio and television stations are not responsible for the defamatory content. Now, broadcast journalists have similar protection for defamation under the First Amendment. It's usually handled as libel, which is the written word, but can also be construed as slander, which is the spoken word. There are more restrictions with respect to privacy for broadcast journalists, specifically consent laws, which we covered already. There's greater difficulty when it comes to intellectual property, so that for some outlets, such as 2020, 60 Minutes, and Dateline, you have to pay royalty fees for materials from a movie, for example. But there's also something called fair use, which for a news program, let's say the 7:30 network news or CNN 24/7, where I can use up to a minute of material from a movie, for example, when someone's doing a review of that movie. Now, 1 minute is just a working definition. It's not etched in stone. Now, new communications technologies, and as I said, I don't like the term new media because it's been around for a long time, but new communications technology is technically the verbiage that the FCC uses. And with digital television, in 1996, the FCC adopted the transition from analog to digital, and it was supposed to happen in 10 years. It took a bit longer, and it also allowed for the retention of analog, which, I doubt that any of you have ever seen rabbit ears or antenna on top of a television, but that's what analog television comes through rather than through cable. And it enabled stations to split one analog station into 4 because an analog channel requires far more information than a digital channel, and so therefore they got 4 channels out of 1. Now, the FCC didn't make them pay for this because it was thought that it would cost so much to change from analog to digital equipment. So the FCC defines new communications technologies as those developed after broadcast television, wireless telephone, satellite broadcasting, and the internet. Now, there have been a lot of changes when it comes to the way that telephone service and therefore wireless service happens, or smartphones, whatever you want to call them. In 1982, AT&T was forced to end its monopoly. AT&T ran the whole system before, and from that it broke it up into Verizon, Qwest, AT&T. One important ruling was in 2002, which basically said that these big boys had to provide access to their digital cable networks to smaller operations like T-Mobile. Okay? And this allowed the expansion of telephone, but perhaps more importantly, the expansion of internet providers. FCC has regulated telephones for years, okay, and thus telephone internet connections face far greater supervision when it comes to pricing and technical standards. Okay, you might be surprised at that, given our wonderful Comcast and Verizon networks, but there are supposed to be standards and pricing limitations. Satellite television, the FCC calls it direct-to-home. Basically, what the FCC is concerned with here is the technical quality of satellite television, whether it's the big KU band things satellite dishes, or the smaller ones, so that there's not what's called bleeding into other channels. Okay. Now, the Internet, email, World Wide Web now reaches now more than 75% of the U.S. public uses the Internet on a regular basis. Okay? There have been limitations on the government's intrusion into restricting free speech on the Internet. So, as part of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, there was an attempt to regulate pornography on the Internet. That failed. It was seen as a restriction on freedom of speech. Then there were attempts to protect children in terms of online access to pornography, and also the notion of virtual child pornography. Okay, those both failed, but in 2003, the United States versus the American Library Association, the court did find that the Children's Internet Protection Act was constitutional, and this law required that libraries that received federal funds needed to connect filters on all computers to block pornography and erotic material. This was extended for the most part to cover most of the high schools that you went to. So I'm sure that you saw filters on your computers at high school, which oftentimes worked to eliminate also other material that was neither pornographic nor erotic. Libel and defamation for the Internet essentially is the same as newspapers and magazines. The Internet service providers like Verizon are essentially exempt from libel. Now keep in mind that international laws will differ on this. Okay. Intellectual property. Basically what has happened is that the Internet faces the same intellectual property standards as all media. So that if you use something, you got to pay for it. Okay. Now all of us do screenshots of photographs that we don't have the rights to, and we put them up on our Facebook site. We're technically violating intellectual property rights. We're supposed to pay for that, but most of the time, the intellectual property right holders only go after the big boys and girls. Napster, Grokster were big cases which which essentially said you can't simply do file sharing without paying for the royalties. Okay, both big cases, and created a revenue stream for radio and television when it came to getting royalties for programming. Now, privacy and the Internet has a little bit more intrusion here. So that in 1999, a federal court in Oregon ruled that the Nuremberg files, which posted the names and addresses of abortion doctors, should be closed down and fined. Okay, and in Kylo versus the United States in 2001, the court found that thermal imaging technology violated individual privacy. Now, this is only for private use of the imaging technology. Police with a court order can use it. Well, so that's all we have for today. I want to thank you very much. I would like to thank Sid for his wonderful, enthusiastic bark, and I apologize for that, but he's a big guy. So we'll see you online. Thanks very much.